In the dim light with the hum of conversation and music around them, no one noticed as he slipped close enough to tilt a small vial over Ariana's glass. A nearly invisible liquid trickled into her cocktail, disappearing without a trace. He repeated the act with her friend's drinks before melting back into the crowd. It took less than half an hour before the drug began to take hold. Ariana felt at first as a strange heaviness in her limbs, like her body was being weighed down by invisible sandbags. Her laughter slowed, her vision blurred. She glanced at her friends. Both looked pale and confused. Something was wrong. She tried to speak, but her voice sounded far away, even to herself. Maxwell was ready. He made a call, and minutes later, a man he had paid slipped into the lounge. The man moved with the urgency of someone on a mission, guiding Ariana away under the pretense of helping her to safety. Her two friends, equally incapacitated, were escorted elsewhere by others in on the plan. Within the hour, Ariana was unconscious in a hotel room Maxwell had booked under another name. The paid stranger staged the scene, removing her dress, climbing into bed beside her, the camera clicking as Maxwell documented every damning angle. It was mechanical, cold, and calculated. By the time Maxwell left, the trap was complete. The photos, once sent, would need no explanation, at least not one Terrence would believe. He could already picture the look on Terrence's face, the disbelief curdling into rage. The perfect marriage, he thought with satisfaction, was about to fracture. Back in Banana Island, Terrence sat in the quiet of their living room, scrolling through project reports on his tablet. Ariana should have been home by now. He glanced at the clock, nearly midnight. He tried her phone once, twice. No answer. A mild concern began to gnaw at him. He sent a message. "Everything okay? Call me." Minutes later, his phone buzzed. Not with a call, but with an anonymous email. No subject line, just an attachment. Against his better judgment, he opened it. The first image hit like a punch to the chest. Ariana in a hotel bed, bare-shouldered beside a man he didn't recognize. The next showed them from another angle. The lighting, the framing, it all screamed intimacy. For a long moment, Terrence couldn't move. His mind was a whirlpool of shock, confusion, and a sharp, searing betrayal. Maxwell's earlier words, "They wouldn't stay loyal for long," flashed uninvited in his head. He dropped the tablet onto the coffee table, his breathing shallow. A small, unsteady voice in him whispered that there had to be an explanation. But louder still was the image, burning into his mind, eroding the trust he had built his life on. The late afternoon sun spilled molten gold over Banana Island, glazing the water in the marina and throwing long, elegant shadows across the palm-lined streets. The Morgan residence stood like a piece of modern art, glass walls catching every shimmer of light, cascading balconies draped in green, and a discreet infinity pool that seemed to merge with the lagoon beyond. Inside, the air was cool, perfumed faintly with sandalwood, and the scent of fresh pastries cooling in the kitchen. Terrence Morgan leaned against the sleek marble island in the kitchen, his dark eyes following the woman bustling between the oven and the counter. Ariana Ballard, his wife of 5 years, wore an apron over a simple silk blouse and fitted jeans, her natural curls pulled into a loose bun. She was humming softly, a sound he always said felt like home. On the counter lay a tray of golden brown meat pies, their buttery aroma making the household staff linger just a little longer in the hall. "You're going to make me late for my meeting," Terrence teased, his voice warm. "If I eat one more, I won't be able to fit into my suit." Ariana laughed, sliding a fresh pie onto a plate. "Then I'll make you a bigger suit, Mr. Morgan. And besides, you can't go to war on an empty stomach." For Terrence, work was war. As one of Lagos's most successful construction equipment manufacturers, he led Morgan Capital Group with precision and relentless ambition. His name commanded respect in boardrooms from Eco-Atlantic to Abuja. Yet here, in this kitchen, with Ariana's laughter softening the edges of his day, he wasn't the untouchable businessman, he was simply her husband. Their life was the picture-perfect dream others envied. Ariana's luxury bakery, Bellar's, sat in the heart of Victoria Island, drawing everyone from CEOs to Nollywood stars. Her cookies and pastries were as famous for their artistry as for their taste. She had built her empire from the ground up, and Terrence had been her biggest cheerleader. In turn, she had stood beside him through late nights, high-stakes deals, and the kind of pressure only those at the top could understand. People didn't just admire them, they idolized them. "I love your marriage," strangers would say. "The way your husband adores you, the way your wife supports you. It's rare." And it was true. In public, Terrence's eyes always found Ariana's, as if she were the anchor in every room. In private, she was the one who could pull him back from the edge when the world demanded too much. But every perfect picture has a shadow, and theirs came in the form of Maxwell Aso. Maxwell had been Terrence's friend since university days, charming, reckless, and magnetic in a way that drew women in and discarded them just as quickly. His relationships were a trail of broken promises and bruised hearts. He drank too much, gambled too carelessly, and scoffed at the idea of commitment. Where Terrence was disciplined, Maxwell was chaos. Where Terrence built, Maxwell destroyed. Over the years, Ariana had been polite but wary around him. There was something in Maxwell's gaze, too lingering, too calculating, that made her uncomfortable. But she'd never given it voice, partly because Terrence had always insisted Maxwell was just going through a rough phase. What she didn't know was that Maxwell harbored something darker than aimlessness: envy. Maxwell couldn't stand to watch them together. The way Ariana's hand rested naturally in Terrence's. The way Terrence seemed immune to temptation because he had already found everything he wanted at home. Maxwell, who could never keep a woman, resented the man who had one worth keeping. That evening, as Terrence buttoned his suit jacket for a late board meeting, Maxwell's name lit up his phone. "Drinks at the club tomorrow?" Maxwell's tone was casual. Terrence smiled faintly. "We'll see. Ariana's planning a girls' night with her friends. I might take the opportunity to catch up." Maxwell hummed, an unspoken thought curling in his voice. "You're lucky, you know. Most women with that much attention on them, well, they wouldn't stay loyal for long." The words slid under Terrence's skin like a splinter. He shook them off. He knew Ariana. She wasn't most women, but Maxwell's smirk lingered in his mind longer than it should have. After Terrence left for his meeting, Ariana cleaned the kitchen, humming as she stacked the cooling trays. She had been looking forward to the next day for weeks, a night out with her two closest friends. It wasn't often she had time to step away from the bakery and the life she shared with Terrence. It wasn't that she needed space from him. Rather, she wanted to remember what it felt like to be just Ariana for an evening, not Mrs. Morgan, the society wife everyone admired. She had no idea that Maxwell had overheard her plans. Later that night, Ariana curled up on their cream-colored sofa with a book, waiting for Terrence to return. Through the wide glass walls, the lagoon sparkled under the moonlight. She thought about how far they'd come, about the bakery's expansion plans, and the holiday trip they were discussing for Christmas. There was a quiet confidence in their love, the kind born from years of mutual respect and sacrifice. And yet, outside their walls, a storm was already gathering. Maxwell's resentment had found its opening, and he intended to strike not with open confrontation, but with the kind of precision that would leave no visible fingerprints. In his mind, he justified it. Terrence needed to be woken up to see that no one's love was unshakable. And if he could have the satisfaction of watching that perfect picture crack, all the better. That night, Ariana fell asleep on the sofa, books slipping from her fingers, unaware that her life, so neatly built, was about to be dismantled piece by piece. The next afternoon in Lagos carried that familiar hum of movement and money, the clipped conversations of executives on their phones, the rhythmic honking of impatient drivers, the distant thud of construction somewhere across the lagoon. For Terrence Morgan, this was the sound of his empire breathing. He was at Morgan Capital Group's headquarters in Victoria Island, finalizing a multi-million naira contract with a German supplier. Everything about his life, at least on paper, was perfectly balanced. A thriving company, a beautiful home, in a marriage that was both a comfort and a crown. But in the shadows of his life, Maxwell Oho was quietly watching and scheming. Maxwell lounged in one of the high-backed leather chairs in Terrence's private office, sipping a tumbler of whiskey as though he owned the place. His eyes flicked to the view outside, the stretch of lagoon dotted with yachts and the glimmer of Echo Atlantic's skyline, and then back to Terrence, who was absorbed in paperwork. "You ever think about what would happen if it all just vanished?" Maxwell asked suddenly, his tone deceptively casual. Terrence glanced up, amused. "Vanished? Not likely. I built this with too much blood and sweat for it to vanish overnight." "I'm not talking about your company," Maxwell said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "I'm talking about her, Ariana." Terrence frowned. "What about Ariana?" Maxwell shrugged, leaning back like a man about to deliver bad news but dressing it up as friendly concern. "Look, T, don't take this the wrong way, but women like her, with beauty, brains, money, men notice. They look, they offer, and sometimes even the best can be tempted." Terrence's jaw tightened. "Ariana isn't like that." Maxwell raised his brows, lips curling into the kind of half-smile that spoke volumes without saying a word. "Maybe, but temptation doesn't ask for permission, does it?" It was a deliberate seed, planted deep. Terrence shook his head and returned to his papers. But the remark clung to him like the Lagos heat, heavy and irritating. He knew Ariana. He knew her loyalty, but now Maxwell's voice lingered in his mind like the echo of something poisonous. That evening, Ariana sat at her dressing table, applying a soft touch of rose lipstick. The golden hour light filtered through the blinds, painting her skin in warm tones. She had chosen a flowing, emerald green dress that swayed at her knees, playful but elegant. Tonight was for her friends, Neka and Ifeoma, both women she'd known since university. They had planned dinner at a rooftop restaurant in Ikoyi, followed by music and dancing in one of the newer lounges along Osumba Ombadwe Road. She heard Terrence's footsteps in the hallway before he appeared at the doorway, his tie loosened from the day. "You look beautiful," he said, leaning against the frame. She smiled, holding his gaze in the mirror. "Thank you. It's just a night with the girls. Don't wait up." He walked over, resting his hands lightly on her shoulders. "Have fun. Be safe." For a moment, it was as it always had been. Mutual respect, no questions asked. But in the back of his mind, Maxwell's earlier words pulsed faintly, like the low bass of a distant song. Maxwell knew about Ariana's night out before she even left the house. Through a casual conversation with a mutual acquaintance and a habit of listening for her name in the right circles, he had gathered enough to form a plan. He spent the afternoon making calls, arranging the pieces like a chess player, anticipating a checkmate. By the time Ariana and her friends were seated at the rooftop restaurant, laughing over plates of suya spiced chicken and coconut rice, Maxwell was already in motion. Disguised under a black hoodie and a low-brimmed cap, he blended into the late-evening crowd when they later arrived at the lounge. Lagos nightlife was a swirl of color and motion, neon lights reflecting off glass, the bass-heavy music vibrating through the floor. The scent of perfume and expensive cologne thick in the air. He kept his distance at first, watching them from across the room as they danced under the warm red and gold lights. Ariana's laughter rang out above the music, free and unguarded. To Maxwell, it was the perfect image to shatter. He waited until they returned to their table, breathless from dancing, their drinks waiting. In the dim light, with the hum of conversation and music around them, no one noticed as he slipped close enough to tilt a small vial over Ariana's glass. A nearly invisible liquid trickled into her cocktail, disappearing without a trace. He repeated the act with her friends' drinks before melting back into the crowd. It took less than half an hour before the drug began to take hold. Ariana felt at first as a strange heaviness in her limbs, like her body was being weighed down by invisible sandbags. Her laughter slowed, her vision blurred. She glanced at her friends. Both looked pale and confused. Something was wrong. She tried to speak, but her voice sounded far away, even to herself. Maxwell was ready. He made a call, and minutes later, a man he had paid slipped into the lounge. The man moved with the urgency of someone on a mission, guiding Ariana away under the pretense of helping her to safety. Her two friends, equally incapacitated, were escorted elsewhere by others in on the plan. Within the hour, Ariana was unconscious in a hotel room Maxwell had booked under another name. The paid stranger staged the scene, removing her dress, climbing into bed beside her, the camera clicking as Maxwell documented every damning angle. It was mechanical, cold, and calculated. By the time Maxwell left, the trap was complete. The photos, once sent, would need no explanation, at least not one Terrence would believe. He could already picture the look on Terrence's face, the disbelief curdling into rage. The perfect marriage, he thought with satisfaction, was about to fracture. Back in Banana Island, Terrence sat in the quiet of their living room, scrolling through project reports on his tablet. Ariana should have been home by now. He glanced at the clock, nearly midnight. He tried her phone once, twice. No answer. A mild concern began to gnaw at him. He sent a message. "Everything okay? Call me." Minutes later, his phone buzzed. Not with a call, but with an anonymous email. No subject line, just an attachment. Against his better judgment, he opened it. The first image hit like a punch to the chest. Ariana in a hotel bed, bare-shouldered beside a man he didn't recognize. The next showed them from another angle. The lighting, the framing, it all screamed intimacy. For a long moment, Terrence couldn't move. His mind was a whirlpool of shock, confusion, and a sharp, searing betrayal. Maxwell's earlier words, "They wouldn't stay loyal for long," flashed uninvited in his head. He dropped the tablet onto the coffee table, his breathing shallow. A small, unsteady voice in him whispered that there had to be an explanation. But louder still was the image, burning into his mind, eroding the trust he had built his life on. When Ariana finally stumbled through the door in the early hours of the morning, she had no idea the world she was walking into had already shifted against her. Ariana's first sensation was the sharp throb in her temples. Her head felt as if it had been stuffed with cotton, the pounding in her skull matching the rhythm of her heartbeat. She tried to shift, but the sheets tangled around her legs, heavy and unfamiliar. The air smelled faintly of stale cologne and hotel disinfectant. Her eyes snapped open. The ceiling above her wasn't her own. Panic surged through the fog in her mind as she took in the room. A sterile, impersonal hotel suite with the curtains drawn. Her emerald green dress lay crumpled on a chair in the corner, her shoes tossed carelessly nearby. She looked down and realized, to her horror, that she was wearing only her underwear. "What in God's name?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. She racked her memory for the events of the previous night, but everything beyond dancing with Nneka and Ifeoma was a blank. A frightening, unyielding blank. She could recall holding her drink, laughing at something Ifeoma had said, then nothing. Her phone was on the nightstand, its screen dark. She grabbed it, relieved to find it still had battery, but her relief was short-lived. There were over 20 missed calls from Terrence. Her stomach knotted. She had never in all their years together stayed out without calling him. Ariana dressed quickly, her hands trembling, and fled the room. The hotel lobby was quiet at that early hour, the staff barely glancing at her as she slipped outside into the soft gray light of dawn. The streets were nearly empty, the city not yet fully awake. She called Nneka and Ifeoma. No answer. She tried again, still nothing. A rising wave of fear crashed over her. Something had happened to all of them. Something none of them had consented to. By the time she reached their Banana Island home, the sun was higher in the sky, turning the lagoon outside into a sheet of gold. She expected to see Terrence pacing, worried. She expected questions, perhaps even frustration. What she didn't expect was the look in his eyes when he opened the door. It wasn't concern, it was cold, hard fury. He didn't greet her, didn't ask if she was okay. Instead, he stepped aside, letting her walk into the living room. Her gaze fell instantly on the coffee table, on the tablet lying there, its screen still lit. She froze. On the screen was a photo. Her, in bed, next to a man she had never seen in her life. Ariana's mouth went dry. What? What is this? Terrence's voice was low, clipped. You tell me. She took a step toward the tablet, her legs unsteady. I don't know who that is. I don't even... Terrence, I woke up in a hotel room. He laughed then, a bitter, humorless sound that cut through her words. Don't insult me, Ariana. Don't stand there and tell me you don't know. I'm telling you the truth. Her voice cracked, the weight of the accusation pressing against her chest. I went out with Neka and Efeoma. We had a few drinks. That's the last thing I remember. I know, something happened. I would never. He stepped closer, his eyes burning into hers. Never? Look at those pictures and tell me again that it wasn't you. Tell me that's not your dress on the chair. Tell me that's not you in that bed. Tears blurred her vision. It's me, but it's not what you think. I swear to you, Terrence, I would never do this to you. You're my world. His jaw tightened. You think your words can erase what I've seen? She reached for him, but he pulled back, the distance between them no longer just physical. Terrence, please! Enough! His voice rose, sharp and final. I can't do this anymore. The silence after his outburst was deafening. Ariana stood frozen, her chest heaving, the taste of salt on her lips from the tears streaming down her face. She searched his eyes for even a flicker of doubt, a shred of the man who had once promised to believe her over anyone else. But all she found was a wall. By the time she packed a small bag and left, the morning sun was blazing. She didn't look back as she stepped into the waiting cab, her fingers gripping the handle of her overnight bag so tightly that her knuckles ached. She didn't know where she was going, only that she couldn't stay here, in the house that had been their sanctuary. Terrence watched from the upstairs window as the cab pulled away. His chest felt heavy, but he told himself he was doing the right thing. Trust, once broken, was impossible to rebuild, or so he believed. And yet, as the car turned the corner and disappeared from sight, a part of him wanted to run after it, to demand answers until the truth fell into place. But the pictures were all the truth he needed. Across town, Maxwell sat in the dim corner of an upscale bar, sipping his drink with quiet satisfaction. He had seen the storm pass over the Morgans' perfect life, and now it was only a matter of time before the cracks became permanent. He thought about calling Terrence to check in, but decided against it. No, better to let the wound fester. Better to wait until Terrence himself came looking for someone to confide in. For Maxwell, patience was part of the game. That night, Ariana tried calling Neka and Efeoma again. Still no answer. The silence from her friends was almost as unbearable as Terrence's refusal to believe her. She curled up on the bed of the small guest house she'd found for the night, staring at the ceiling as the events replayed in her mind. The strange heaviness in her body, the blank space where her memories should have been, the unfamiliar hotel room. It all pointed to something sinister, but without proof her words were nothing but air. Somewhere in the city, the man she loved, the only man she had ever loved, was alone in the home they had built together, convinced she had betrayed him. And somewhere else, the person who had set this in motion was celebrating. The following days unfolded in a haze of cold words and slammed doors. There were no long conversations, no late-night reconciliations on the sofa. Terrence avoided Ariana entirely, retreating into his office or leaving the house before dawn. When they did speak, his voice was clipped, each word a reminder that he no longer trusted her. The final blow came a week later. Terrence arrived home early from a site inspection to find Ariana in the living room, a folder on the coffee table. Her eyes were red, her posture tense. She didn't look up when he entered. "What's this?" he asked, gesturing to the folder. "Divorce papers," she said quietly, her voice shaking. "You've made it clear you don't believe me, Terrence. I can't keep begging you to trust me." He stood there for a moment, the words settling like stones in his chest. He wanted to argue, to tell her how much it hurt to even consider that the woman he had loved so fiercely could betray him. But the photograph still burned in his mind. Maxwell's warnings whispered through the cracks of his thoughts. In the end, he simply nodded. If that's what you want. Ariana's eyes filled again. It's not what I want, but it's what you've already decided. She signed the papers in silence. The news spread faster than either of them could have imagined. In Lagos society circles, no marriage was private, especially not one as admired as theirs. Whispers floated through bakeries, high-end salons, and exclusive clubs. Did you hear? The Morgans are over. Apparently she cheated, got caught red-handed. He kicked her out immediately. The gossip blogs had a field day. They didn't bother with facts, only sensational headlines. A grainy, blurred photo of Ariana in the hotel room, taken from the same images Terrence had received, made its way online. Her name trended for all the wrong reasons. Business at Bellard's slowed. Some customers still came out of loyalty, but others, faces Ariana had seen for years, avoided her gaze entirely. It wasn't just the loss of sales, it was the loss of respect. Every time she stepped into the bakery, she felt eyes on her, whispers curling around her like smoke. One evening, she sat in the back office of the bakery, staring at the ledger. The numbers were still good, profitable even, but her heart wasn't in it anymore. Every corner of Lagos held a memory of her life with Terrence. The cafe where they'd had their first date, the boardroom where he'd brought her coffee before a pitch, the waterfront where they'd once celebrated her birthday. And every one of those places now hurt to think about. The next morning, she made her decision. She called her accountant, arranged the sale of the bakery to a trusted buyer, and booked a one-way ticket to Abuja. The last time she saw Terrence before leaving Lagos was not planned. She was loading the last box into a friend's SUV when his black Range Rover slowed to a stop outside the house she had been renting. He stepped out, dressed in his usual tailored perfection, but there was no warmth in his expression. Only that guarded, unreadable look he had worn since the night everything fell apart. "You're leaving," he said, not a question. She nodded. "There's nothing left for me here." His jaw worked as if he wanted to speak, but nothing came. Instead, he gave a stiff nod, turned back to the car, and drove away. She watched him until he disappeared from sight, telling herself that she wouldn't cry. She had already shed enough tears for both of them. Abuja was quieter, slower in its rhythm. Ariana rented a modest apartment with a view of the city skyline and enrolled in a few business courses at a local institute to keep herself occupied. She started baking again, but only for herself and the neighbors who had become her friends. She never once set up shop or tried to open another bakery. She told herself it was because she needed rest. But deep down, she knew it was because she didn't want her success tied to a city that had spat her out. The first few months were the hardest. Nights were the worst, when the city was quiet and her mind was loud. She thought about calling Terrence, about telling him once more that she hadn't betrayed him, that something had been done to her. But she never did. She didn't think she could bear hearing disbelief in his voice again. Meanwhile, back in Lagos, Terrence threw himself into work with an almost frightening intensity. Morgan Capital Group expanded aggressively. New contracts, new partnerships, new territories. His name appeared in business magazines, his face on the covers of industry journals. From the outside, he was thriving. But those who knew him well saw the difference. He stopped attending social events unless absolutely necessary. The laughter that had once come easily now felt forced. He dated no one. His assistant once joked that he was married to the company, but the truth was more complicated. Ariana had been his first everything, his first love, his first partner, the first person he'd ever truly trusted. Even after their marriage dissolved, he found himself unable to even imagine intimacy with someone else. It wasn't loyalty exactly, it was that no one else measured up, and the idea of risking another betrayal was unbearable. Maxwell, of course, remained close, presenting himself as the ever-supportive friend. He often joined Terrence for drinks, slipping in subtle jabs about Ariana, her high-maintenance ways, the suspicious company she kept. Terrence didn't engage much, but neither did he challenge him. It was easier to keep the past buried. 5 years passed this way, Ariana in Abuja, building a quiet, contained life. Terence in Lagos, building an empire and locking away his heart. One sunny Abuja afternoon, Ariana stood in her kitchen rolling dough for meat pies. The radio played faintly in the background, a call-in show discussing new investment opportunities in Lagos. Something about the energy in the announcer's voice, the casual talk of Victoria Island and Ikoyi, sparked something deep in her chest. She realized with startling clarity that she was ready to live again, to build again, not in spite of the city that had hurt her, but because it was still hers. She booked her return ticket that same day. The Lagos skyline glimmered in the late afternoon haze as Ariana's flight descended toward Murtala Muhammad International Airport. The city was exactly as she remembered, restless, sprawling, alive. It had been 5 years since she had left in shame, her life crumbling behind her. Now she was back with a clear purpose: to rebuild. Her cab wound through the bustling streets, past the familiar neighborhoods she had once known so well. Victoria Island's energy buzzed in the air. New restaurants, sleek towers, and a few old landmarks that seemed unchanged by time. Yet for all its noise and speed, Lagos still felt like home. She had missed its scent, its warmth, its pulse. The apartment she had rented was in a quiet, upscale lane in Ikoyi, tucked between lush gardens and tree-lined streets. It wasn't Banana Island. She wasn't ready to plant herself in the heart of society's gaze. But it was still high-end, private, and close enough to the city's best clientele for her bakery. As the driver slowed to pull into the building's parking lot, Ariana's eyes caught on the house directly opposite hers. It stood behind tall black gates, a modern architectural masterpiece with wide terraces, floor-to-ceiling windows, and meticulously landscaped grounds. White walls and sharp lines gave it a bold, clean look, while the warm glow of the interior lighting hinted at quiet luxury. Beautiful, she murmured to herself. Whoever owned it had impeccable taste. She imagined the kind of person who might live there. An artist, maybe, or a corporate magnate. Someone who appreciated beauty and precision. She didn't know yet how close she was to the truth. The next morning, Ariana stood in front of her new bakery, Belard's Grande, a sleek, glass-fronted space in the heart of Victoria Island. It was bigger than her first location by more than double, with an open-plan kitchen where customers could watch the bakers work, the aroma of freshly baked bread and pastries drifting onto the street. Inside, every detail bore her touch: polished marble counters, gold-trimmed display cases, soft lighting, and tall windows that flooded the space with natural light. The logo above the entrance, her name in elegant script, felt like a declaration. I'm back. She had spent weeks working with her team to perfect the launch menu. There were her signature meat pies, buttery and golden, their rich fillings spiced to perfection. Cookies in neat glass jars, chocolate chip, coconut, shortbread, sat alongside intricately frosted cupcakes and artisan breads. She had hired a small but skilled staff, each one hand-picked for their talent and passion. By the end of the first day, Belard's Grande was buzzing. Business owners in tailored suits stopped by for afternoon coffee. Mothers treated their children to warm cookies. A few familiar faces from her old customer base slipped in quietly, their smiles genuine, their words of welcome heartfelt. The her from 5 years ago began to fade, replaced by the thrill of creation. In the evenings, Ariana would return to her apartment, often with a small box of pastries to enjoy while sitting on her balcony. She liked the quiet moments, watching the street below, hearing the faint hum of the city at night. And each time her eyes drifted toward that house across the road. She noticed little details now, the subtle change in lighting between the rooms, the gardener who came twice a week to tend the front hedges. Occasionally, a sleek black Range Rover would pull into the driveway, the tinted windows concealing its passenger. Whoever lived there seemed private, almost elusive. One evening, she leaned against her balcony railing, a cup of tea warming her hands, and caught herself wondering about the life inside those walls. She smiled faintly, shaking her head at the thought. It was none of her business. Her focus was on her own fresh start. 2 weeks after the bakery's opening, Ariana decided to take a late evening walk. The air was cooler than usual, the sky painted in deep blues and streaks of fading orange. She wore a simple wrap dress, her hair loose, the sound of her sandals soft against the pavement. She strolled slowly down the lane, inhaling the scent of frangipani blossoms from a nearby garden. Her mind was on the day's sales, on the new wholesale orders she'd secured from a luxury hotel in Eco-Atlantic. She wasn't expecting company. She certainly wasn't expecting him. They both turned the corner at the same moment, and time seemed to catch its breath. Terrence Morgan. Her heart stopped. For a moment, she thought her mind was playing tricks on her. But there he was, tall, broad-shouldered, impeccably dressed in a dark shirt and tailored trousers, his face more mature than she remembered, but unmistakably his. His eyes widened as recognition hit, the same shock mirrored in her own expression. "Ariana," he breathed. "Terrence." Her voice was barely above a whisper. They stood there in the soft glow of the street lamps, neither moving. 5 years of silence pressed between them. 5 years of hurt, questions, and what-ifs. Ariana's fingers curled slightly at her sides, as if holding on to her composure. She wanted to say something, anything, but the words tangled in her throat. Terrence's gaze swept over her, her face, her posture, the quiet strength in the way she stood. It was as if nothing and everything had changed. 1,000 memories flashed in his mind, her laughter in their kitchen, her head on his shoulder on rainy nights, the way she used to look at him like he was her whole world. He swallowed, realizing his chest felt tight. "I didn't know you were back." "I just got in a few weeks ago," she said. "I opened another bakery." His lips lifted faintly, a shadow of the smile she remembered. "Of course you did." The air between them was thick with unspoken things. Ariana glanced toward her building, and for the first time, noticed the way his gaze shifted across the street to the house she'd been admiring all this time. "You," she began slowly. "You live there?" Terrence gave a small nod. Her pulse skipped. The beautiful house she'd been watching was his. "I should," she started, gesturing vaguely toward her apartment. He hesitated as though fighting an inner battle, then said, "Maybe we could talk sometime." Ariana looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his. Then she nodded, a quiet agreement. "Sometime." She turned toward her door, her heart pounding. Behind her, Terrence watched until she disappeared inside, his mind already turning over what had just happened and what it meant. Terrence didn't sleep much after seeing Ariana again. He lay in the quiet darkness of his bedroom, staring at the ceiling, his mind looping through every detail of their brief encounter. The way her voice had trembled, the flicker of guarded hope in her eyes, the calm poise in her posture. She didn't look like a woman hiding guilt. She looked like someone who had carried a heavy truth for far too long. By morning, he knew he couldn't ignore it. 5 years of silence was long enough. Late that afternoon, Terrence stood at Ariana's door, hands in his pockets, feeling strangely out of place. The last time he had been here, in any space that was hers, was before their world collapsed. He had rehearsed what he might say, but when the door opened, the sight of her in a soft blue blouse and black jeans stole the words from him. "Terrence," she said, surprise in her tone, though not unkind. "I didn't expect—" "I know," he said quickly. "I just thought maybe we could talk. Properly. Not on the street." She hesitated, then stepped aside. "Come in." The apartment was warm, filled with the faint aroma of vanilla and cinnamon. A vase of fresh flowers sat on the coffee table, sunlight pouring through the wide windows. It felt lived in, personal, a reflection of the woman he had once known better than anyone. They sat opposite each other, an untouched pot of tea between them. "I don't want to waste your time," he began. "I came because I realized. I never really let you explain. Back then, I was so sure of what I saw that I didn't think there could be another version of the truth." Ariana looked at him, her expression unreadable. "And now?" Now, he exhaled slowly. I'm not sure. Seeing you again? It's different. She was quiet for a moment, then leaned forward, her voice steady but tinged with something deeper. Terrence, I'm going to say this once, and I'm going to say it plainly. I did not cheat on you. That night, something was done to me. To us. Me and my friends. He frowned. What do you mean? We went out, had a few drinks. We were laughing, dancing, nothing unusual. Then I started feeling wrong, heavy, like I couldn't control my body. My vision blurred. Neka and Ifeoma were the same. That's the last thing I remember until I woke up in that hotel room. Terrence's jaw tightened. And the man, I don't know who he was, she said firmly. I never met him before, and I have never seen him again. I woke up half-dressed, terrified. I grabbed my things and ran. I came home to you thinking you'd help me figure out what happened. Instead, you showed me those pictures. The memory sliced through him. How quickly he had moved from worry to fury. How easily Maxwell's poisoned words had fed the worst interpretation. Ariana's eyes shone, but she didn't cry. You were my first everything, Terrence. My first love, my first and only man. Even after we divorced, even after you broke me apart, I couldn't bring myself to be with anyone else. Because despite it all, you were my world. The words hit him like a physical blow. He opened his mouth and closed it again. Shame prickled at the back of his neck. If that's true. It is, she cut in softly but firmly. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The sound of the city outside seemed distant, muffled, as if the apartment itself had sealed them in. Finally, Terrence said, What if we tried to look into it again? That night, the hotel, the lounge, there might still be footage. Her brows lifted slightly. After 5 years? It's a long shot, but I have contacts and I owe you that much. Ariana studied him for a moment, as if weighing the risk of hope. You owe me more than that, she said quietly. But if you can help me find the truth, maybe we can both finally sleep at night. They began that evening. Terrence made calls to security firms, old business contacts, even a few hotel managers who owed him favors. Ariana wrote down every detail she could remember from that night. The sequence of places, the layout of the lounge, the color of the lighting, even the arrangement of tables. Some of it felt hazy, but she was determined. At one point, Terrence looked across the table at her, the lamplight catching in her eyes. Why didn't you fight harder back then? Why didn't you push me to listen? Ariana's lips pressed into a thin line. Because I did, and you looked at me like I was a liar. You had already decided I was guilty. I wasn't going to keep breaking myself against a wall that wouldn't move. The sting of her words sat heavy in his chest. He wanted to tell her he'd been hurt, that he'd felt blindsided, but deep down he knew none of that excused what he'd done. 2 days later, one of Terrence's contacts came through. A private security firm that had worked in the area in 2017 still had backup footage from the street outside the lounge. It wasn't perfect. The angle caught the entrance partially obscured by passing cars. But as they watched the grainy video in Terrence's study, Ariana leaned forward sharply. Pause, she said. He froze the frame. There, under the dim glow of the street lamp, was a figure in a dark hoodie and cap, lingering near the entrance. He wasn't looking at the camera. He was watching the door, his posture tense and deliberate. And though the quality was poor, Ariana felt the hairs on her arms rise. Terrence, she whispered. I've seen that stance before. I know who it is, he said grimly, his jaw tightening. Maxwell. The room went silent, except for the faint hum of the computer. Terrence sat back slowly, realization dawning like a cold dawn in his mind. Memories of Maxwell's subtle jabs, his timely warnings, the way he had seemed almost pleased when the marriage fell apart. They all fell into place like pieces of a puzzle he hadn't wanted to see. Terrence turned to her, his voice low. Ariana, if Maxwell did this, if he set you up. She met his gaze steadily. Then you'll finally understand what I've been saying for 5 years. He nodded slowly, a storm building behind his eyes. We're going to find out. And when we do, I swear, he's going to answer for it. For the first time in years, something in Ariana's chest loosened. There was still a long road ahead, but now at least she wasn't walking it alone. The air in Terrence's study was heavy with a new tension. For years, Maxwell had been a fixture in his life. A friend from their reckless youth, a man who had sat at his wedding table and toasted to his happiness. Now, the grainy, still image on the screen recast him in a different light. The realization wasn't just bitter, it was nauseating. Terrence leaned forward, elbows braced on his desk. One frame isn't enough. We need something more. Footage inside the lounge, maybe the hotel lobby. If Maxwell went that far, there's a trail. Ariana sat opposite him, her hands curled around a mug of untouched tea. You really think we'll find it after 5 years? His gaze met hers, steady and intent. I have to, because if I don't, then I'll never forgive myself. The next morning, Terrence began pulling strings. Old contacts in Lagos security networks, former contractors from hotel renovation projects, even a discreet inquiry with a police officer he trusted. He moved with the efficiency of a man used to getting answers, used to control. But this was different. This time, the answers weren't just for him. They were for her. Ariana, too, reached out to her network. One of her former suppliers, whose cousin worked at the lounge in question, promised to check their archives. It was a long shot, but desperation fueled them both. 3 days later, the breakthrough came. Hain, a retired security manager from the hotel where Ariana had woken up, still had archived footage from the lobby for that week. It had been transferred onto an old hard drive before the system was replaced. And though most people would have considered it junk, he'd kept it out of habit. When he met him in his modest Sur-L'air apartment, he handed over the drive with a knowing look. I don't know what happened between you two, he said, eyes flicking between them. But this might change things. Back in Terrence's study, the footage played on the large monitor. The hotel lobby was lit in warm tones, the date stamp in the corner marking the night of Ariana's disappearance. Staff moved about, guests came and went, nothing unusual. And then he appeared. Maxwell. Even under the hoodie and cap, there was no mistaking him. He strode in behind 2 men, one of whom was guiding a clearly disoriented Ariana toward the elevators. She was half-supported, her head lolling slightly, her steps sluggish. Her dress was still in place, but she looked wrong, vulnerable, not in control. Terrence's stomach churned. Maxwell's head turned just enough for the camera to catch his face in profile as he spoke to the man holding Ariana. Then, after glancing around, he walked to the front desk, slid something across to the receptionist, cash from the look of it, and gestured toward the elevator. Moments later, Ariana and the stranger disappeared from the frame, Maxwell trailing behind them. Ariana's breath hitched. She had been prepared for proof, but seeing it, the ease with which Maxwell had orchestrated it, the casual way he had paid for whatever he needed, made her skin crawl. Terrence didn't speak. His eyes stayed locked on the screen, jaw tight, shoulders rigid. He replayed the clip again and again, as if trying to etch every movement into memory. On the 4th replay, he stood abruptly, pacing to the window. The view of the lagoon shimmered in the distance, but he barely saw it. This is on me, he said finally, his voice low but fierce. I let that man close to us. I let his words into my head. And when it mattered, I chose to believe him over you. Ariana's throat tightened. You didn't just believe him, Terrence. You destroyed us because of him. He turned, the guilt in his eyes raw. I know. And if I could take it back... She shook her head. You can't, but you can make sure he never does this to anyone else. That night, Terrence sat alone in his living room, the footage still looping in his mind. Every memory of Maxwell now felt tainted, every laugh they'd shared, every deal they'd celebrated. He thought of all the times Maxwell had lingered too long in their home, how his eyes had swept over Ariana like she was a prize he couldn't have. How had he been so blind? In the quiet, a memory surfaced. Maxwell's voice the week after the divorce, telling him he dodged a bullet, insisting Ariana would have ruined him eventually. Back then, Terrence had nodded, too numb to argue. Now those words felt like another twist of the knife. 2 days later, Ariana called. "I have the footage from the lounge." Terrence met her at her apartment, and together they watched the grainy video from the club's security system. It showed Maxwell slipping something into Ariana's drink while her back was turned, then casually blending into the crowd. Minutes later, she and her friends began to falter, their movements sluggish and uncoordinated. It was undeniable. Terrence sat back, the weight of it pressing into his chest. The evidence was irrefutable. Maxwell had drugged her, arranged for the hotel setup, and then used the staged photographs to end their marriage. Ariana turned to him. "Now you know." He looked at her, his voice rough. "I knew the moment I saw the hotel footage, but seeing this," he exhaled sharply. "I don't have the words for how much I've failed you." "You can't change the past," she said quietly, "but you can help me get justice." He nodded. "We will, and I'll be standing right beside you." That night, Terrence made one more call, this time to a high-ranking police contact. He explained the situation, the evidence, and the urgency. The officer agreed to meet in person the next morning. When he hung up, Terrence found himself thinking about what would come after. The public apology Ariana deserved, the years they'd lost, and the love he had buried so deep that seeing her again had felt like pulling air into lungs that had been starved too long. He didn't know if she would ever take him back, but he knew he would spend every day trying. The next morning was heavy with Lagos humidity, the air thick even before sunrise. Terrence stood in the driveway of his Banana Island home, his Range Rover idling at the curb. Ariana arrived moments later in a cream blouse and black trousers, her hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun. There was no small talk, just a shared understanding that today would change everything. In the backseat of the SUV sat a slim black folder. Inside were the printed stills from the lounge and hotel footage, the timestamps clearly visible, the images damning. Terrence had looked at them so many times in the last 48 hours that they were seared into his mind. They drove in silence to the gated estate where Maxwell lived. 2 unmarked police vehicles were already parked discreetly nearby. Inspector Adedeji, the officer Terrence had called, stepped out as they approached. He was tall, with a calm authority about him, and he nodded to both of them. "Mr. Morgan, Miss Bellard, we're ready when you are." Maxwell's house was as loud as his personality, bright colors, overstuffed furniture, and a faint haze of cigar smoke clinging to the air. He opened the door wearing a silk robe and a smirk that faltered when he saw Ariana standing next to Terrence. "Well, this is a surprise," Maxwell drawled, leaning against the doorframe. "Didn't think I'd ever see you two in the same room again." Terrence's voice was ice. "We need to talk. Inside." Maxwell raised a brow but stepped aside. "By all means." They entered the living room, the police officers quietly taking positions near the door. Ariana stayed close to Terrence, her expression unreadable, though her pulse was racing. Terrence set the black folder on the coffee table and flipped it open. "Recognize these?" Maxwell glanced at the photographs and let out a short laugh. "Old news, my friend. You're the one who sent me crying into my whiskey over those." "This isn't what you think," Terrence said, his tone sharpening. He slid another set of images across the table, still frames from the lounge security footage. Maxwell's smirk began to fade. "That's you," Ariana said, her voice steady. "At the club, slipping something into my drink." Maxwell's gaze flickered to the police officers, then back to the images. "You can't prove that's anything illegal. Could be anything in my hand." Terrence didn't blink. "Then explain this." He switched to the hotel lobby footage, pausing at the moment Maxwell handed cash to the receptionist, then followed Ariana and the stranger into the elevator. "Explain why you were there, why you paid someone, why you trailed her into that room." For the first time, Maxwell's bravado cracked. "I don't have to explain anything to you." Inspector Adedeji stepped forward. "Actually, you do. This is evidence in a criminal investigation. You can either explain it here or at the station." Maxwell's eyes narrowed, his tone turning defensive. Oh, so now you believe her? He looked at Terrence with a bitter twist of his mouth. Took you long enough. That's because I have proof now, Terrence said, his voice like steel. And that proof shows you orchestrated everything, drugging her, setting up the photos, sending them to me anonymously. You destroyed my marriage, Maxwell. You destroyed her life. Why? Maxwell hesitated, then let out a humorless laugh. Why? Because I was sick of the two of you parading around like some perfect couple. I've known you for years, Terrence. Always so disciplined, so untouchable, so smug with your loyal little wife. You had what every man wanted, and you didn't even appreciate it. Ariana's stomach turned. So you ruined us out of jealousy? Maxwell's eyes slid to her, his expression dark. Maybe I wanted to see if you were as pure as everyone thought. Maybe I wanted to prove to him that all women are the same. Terrence stepped forward, his hands curling into fists. You're going to rot for this. Maxwell smirked again, but it lacked conviction now. You can't prove intent. Inspector Adedeji's voice was calm but firm. Between the footage, the timestamps, and your own statements just now, Mr. Oho, we can prove more than enough to press charges. Spiking drinks, orchestrating a false scene, and distribution of non-consensual images. You're coming with us. The officers moved in, producing handcuffs. Maxwell's smirk disappeared entirely as cold steel closed around his wrists. This is ridiculous, he protested, but his tone was weaker now, his eyes darting toward Terrence with a flash of something almost like fear. Terrence didn't speak. He simply watched as Maxwell was let out, the sound of the cuffs clicking and the front door closing behind them like the punctuation mark on a sentence 5 years too long. The silence that followed was heavy. Ariana stood very still, her breath slow, her hands clasped in front of her. For so long she had dreamed of this moment, not out of vengeance but for the validation, for the truth to be undeniable. Terrence turned to her. It's over. She looked at him, searching his face for signs of the man she had once loved. No, Terrence, it's just beginning. We still have 5 years of damage to unlearn. He nodded, his voice quiet. And I'm ready to do that work, if you'll let me. They stepped outside into the humid Lagos afternoon. The air smelled faintly of rain, and the sky was beginning to darken with clouds. The police convoy pulled away, Maxwell's figure a shadow in the back seat. Terrence looked at Ariana, the weight of guilt heavy in his eyes. I don't expect you to forgive me tonight, but I am sorry, more than I can ever put into words. I should have trusted you. Her voice was soft but steady. Trust is built, Terrence. You broke it. But you fought for me now, and that means something. They walked toward the Range Rover, side by side but not touching. Yet the distance between them felt smaller than it had in years. The days after Maxwell's arrest felt strangely quiet. For the first time in 5 years, Ariana could walk through Lagos without feeling the weight of unspoken judgment. The gossip blogs had gone silent on her name, the whispers fading as the truth began to ripple through the right channels. Still, the relief didn't erase the ache of all she had lost. She returned to Bellard's Grande and threw herself into the bakery's day-to-day life, rolling out dough, experimenting with new fillings, greeting customers. Each small act was a way to reclaim her space in the city. The scent of warm butter and spices filled her mornings, and the constant rhythm of the kitchen steadied her heart. Terrence came by one afternoon. He didn't call ahead, but the moment he walked in, the air seemed to shift. He wasn't dressed in his usual sharp suits, just a light blue shirt with the sleeves rolled and charcoal trousers. It made him look less like the CEO everyone feared, and more like the man she had once come home to. I didn't want to interrupt, he said as she wiped her hands on her apron. I just wanted to see how you're doing. Ariana raised a brow. And you look like you're where you belong, he said quietly. They began meeting more often after that, though not always by design. Sometimes she'd see him outside their buildings, exchanging a few words before going separate ways. Other times he'd stop by the bakery for coffee and one of her signature pies. Their conversations were awkward at first, as if they were relearning each other's rhythms. One evening about 2 weeks after Maxwell's arrest, Terrence invited her to dinner at a quiet restaurant in Ikoyi. He booked a private terrace overlooking the lagoon, the city lights shimmering on the water. It wasn't an apology in itself, but the care in the gesture didn't go unnoticed. They sat for a while before speaking, the sounds of gentle waves filling the silence. "I've been thinking a lot," he began, "about us, about how quick I was to believe the worst. I've replayed that night over and over, and every time I wish I just stopped to listen." Ariana's fork traced the rim of her plate. "Terrence, it's not just about that night. It's about how you saw me, how fast you let someone else's voice drown out mine." He winced. "I know, and I can't undo that. But I can be different now." Her eyes lifted to his. "Different how?" "By being the man who earned your trust in the first place," he said simply. "By choosing you every time, no matter what." They talked for hours about what they'd each been doing in the last 5 years. About the bakery, about his company's expansion, about the small, ordinary details they used to share so easily. It wasn't like the past had never happened. It lingered in the pauses, in the careful way they chose their words. But for the first time, the conversation didn't feel like a battle. After dinner, they walked along the lagoon's edge. The night air was warm, and Ariana found herself glancing at him when she thought he wouldn't notice. His stride was the same, steady and assured, but there was a softness in him now, a man who had been humbled, who had seen his own flaws up close. When they reached her car, he hesitated. "Can I come by tomorrow? Just to talk?" She thought about it for a long moment, then nodded. "Tomorrow." The next evening, Terrence arrived at her apartment with a small paper bag. Inside was a loaf of bread from a tiny bakery in Paris, flown in that morning. "You used to love this," he said. "Figured we could share it." They sat in her living room with tea, tearing pieces of the crusty loaf and dipping them into warm honey. The conversation moved more easily now, laughter slipping in between stories. It felt almost like the old days, except there was a new awareness between them, an understanding of how fragile even the strongest bonds could be. At one point, Ariana leaned back, studying him. "Do you still live alone in that big house?" He nodded. "Haven't had anyone else there since you left." Her lips curved faintly. 5 years. 5 years, he echoed. "Guess I was loyal in my own way too." Their eyes held for a beat longer than either intended. Ariana looked away first, her heart beating faster than she wanted to admit. A week later, Terrence asked her to take a drive with him. He didn't say where they were going, only that it was important. They ended up at a small piece of land just outside the city, overlooking the water. The breeze carried the scent of salt and earth. "I bought this years ago," he told her. "Always thought I'd build something here, but never knew what. Now I think, maybe it's a place to start over." Ariana turned to him, her hair catching in the wind. "Start over?" "With us," he said, not pretending the past didn't happen, but building something better, slower, stronger. She took a deep breath, looking out at the water. Part of her still carried the hurt, but another part, the part that had never stopped loving him, was ready to move forward. "If we do this, Terrence, it's on my terms too. Equal ground." He nodded. "Always." That night, as he dropped her off, she found herself standing at her door longer than usual. "You should come in," she said, almost without thinking. They didn't rush anything. They talked until the city quieted, until the air between them felt light again. And when he finally left, they both knew that something had shifted, that the decision to start over wasn't just an idea anymore. The first step had already been taken. The ceremony was so quiet it barely made a ripple in Lagos society. No press, no glittering guest lists, just a handful of people who had stood by Ariana and Terrence through everything. The small waterfront chapel in Banana Island smelled faintly of lilies, the afternoon light spilling through its arched windows and casting warm gold over the polished wooden pews. Ariana stood in a simple ivory silk gown, her curls pinned loosely, a bouquet of white roses and eucalyptus in her hands. Across from her, Terrence looked at her like she was the only thing in the room, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit with an open collar. There was no audience to impress, no cameras to perform for, only vows spoken low and sure, meant for each other's ears alone. When the officiant told them to seal it, Terrence leaned forward and kissed her with a tenderness that felt like the culmination of 5 years' worth of unspoken words. A murmur of joy rose from their small circle of guests, and for the first time in a long time, Ariana let herself believe that they had truly made it to the other side. They returned to his Banana Island home that evening, the house she had once left with tears on her cheeks. The space felt different now, not a monument to what they had lost, but a place to fill again with life. In the weeks that followed, they slipped into a rhythm that was both familiar and new. Morning coffee on the terrace overlooking the lagoon, evenings spent in the kitchen, sometimes with her guiding him through one of her recipes, sometimes with him ordering in her favorite seafood pasta when she'd had a long day at the bakery. Terrence made changes to his schedule, carving out more time away from the relentless pull of Morgan Capital Group. Ariana noticed it in the small things, the way he'd show up at the bakery just to sit in the corner with his laptop, the way he'd insist on walking her home, even though they lived across from each other. He wasn't just present, he was intentional. 3 months into their remarriage, Ariana found herself standing in front of the bathroom mirror, holding a small white stick in trembling hands. The 2 faint lines stared back at her, and she pressed her free hand to her mouth, laughter and tears mingling in her throat. That evening, she placed a small box on the dining table during dinner. Terrence eyed it suspiciously, then opened it to find a tiny pair of white baby shoes nestled inside. For a moment, he didn't speak. His gaze lifted to hers, wide with surprise, and then the slowest, most radiant smile spread across his face. He got up from his chair and pulled her into his arms, holding her like he never intended to let go. "We're really doing this?" he murmured against her hair. "We're really doing this," she said, her voice breaking. The months that followed were a different kind of busy. Ariana continued to run Bellard's Grande, though she delegated more, focusing on designing a new line of pastries for the upcoming festive season. Terrence became fiercely protective, accompanying her to doctor's appointments, installing extra safety features around the house, and reading every article he could find on pregnancy. They spent long evenings talking about the nursery, soft green walls, a hand-carved crib, shelves for books and toys. Sometimes Ariana would catch him standing in the doorway, looking into the empty room with an expression she couldn't quite name. She realized then that it wasn't just about the baby. It was about everything they'd fought to get back. When their son was born on a quiet morning in late spring, the world seemed to still. Terrence was the first to hold him, his large hands cradling the tiny bundle as though he were made of glass. He looked down at his son, then up at Ariana, and in that moment she saw the man she had fallen in love with, the one who believed in them without question. They named him Ethan, and just like that, their home was filled with the soft, unpredictable rhythm of new life. Midnight feedings, small cries, gentle lullabies hummed under the dim light of the nursery lamp. One evening, months later, Ariana stood on the balcony, Ethan asleep in her arms. The lagoon reflected the moonlight in ripples, and the warm breeze carried the faint sound of the city beyond. Terrence stepped out behind her, wrapping an arm around her waist. "Remember when you first moved back?" he said quietly. "You stood right here and admired this house from across the street. You didn't know it was mine." She smiled faintly. "I thought the owner had good taste." He pressed a kiss to her temple. The owner thought he'd never get another chance. He was wrong. Ariana leaned into him, her heart full. "We lost a lot of time, Terrence, but maybe we needed to lose it to understand what it's worth." He tightened his hold on her, his voice low and certain. "Then let's make sure we never waste another second." Below them, the water lapped gently against the shore. Inside, the house was warm with the scent of fresh bread cooling in the kitchen, in the quiet peace of a life rebuilt. Not perfect, but honest. They had been to the edge and back, and now, standing together with their son between them, they knew they would guard this life with everything they had. It wasn't just love restored, it was love remade, stronger for having been broken. And this time it was unshakable.